most people probably have one of these HDR displays already. It's probably more a question of like, should I buy another external monitor or something like that? And I think my best answer to that is, definitely think about it when you're ready to upgrade. But I think the first step is just see it for yourself, so you start to understand it before you worry about like what gear you're going to buy. So that'll be the most complex part, is just getting the display.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 282 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I had a fascinating chat with photographer and creator of the Lumenzia Photoshop plugin, Greg Benz. Greg and I went on a deep dive relating to the new HDR features within Lightroom, which are not to be confused with the traditional HDR nomenclature relating to merging photos. This is something totally new and different. If this technology has interested and or confused you at all, like it has me, then this episode is going to clear everything up for you. As always, I appreciate your support of the podcast, either on Patreon or PayPal or even Venmo. You can learn all about the ways that you can support the show by visiting mattpaynephotography.com/podcast. Since this podcast is not sponsored in any way, and I do all of the work myself to keep it going, I can use all the help that I can get. So thank you so much for your help. And for all of you that have already stepped up to support the show, thank you. Okay, let's get to this week's conversation with Greg Benz. All right, Greg Benz, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, hey Matt, good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you again. We just got back not too long ago from participating in a really fun Out of Chicago live conference, and I had the joy of kind of being in the shadows watching a panel that you were on about AI and photography, which was really, really fun to watch.
It was cool. I think we were all kind of figuring it out, and you were asking, I think, the best questions. You had lots of great comments and questions in there. As a panelist, I always appreciate like that kind of engagement. Nice not to be like talking at people. So
yeah, it makes it much more interesting if people actually have questions. Well, cool, Greg. So for people who aren't familiar with you and who you are, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a full-time working photographer, but I'm also a Photoshop instructor and a developer. So I write plugins for Photoshop. So that's maybe a little bit unique to be kind of doing all three of those, but it all comes together really nicely for me. So, and I've been doing this as kind of a full-time gig now since 2016. So this is definitely my life. I'm based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's actually a lot more to shoot here than most people would think, especially, you and I were talking before we started recording about like up the North Shore, like Lake Superior, north of Duluth, is really beautiful. Kind of an overlooked part of the country, but I get all over the globe. I'm just a naturally curious person, so travel, photography, tech, all these things just kind of draw me in, and I love getting all over the place.
Yeah, and have you been up to the Boundary Waters much?
Sadly, no. I've done like day hikes into it. Like one day I did this epic hike where there's this shot I wanted on a cliff near the Canadian border, and I was kind of looking at like how to get there, and I had two options. One was like I drive into Canada, I drive down this road, and I'm like less than half a mile away, and I bushwhack it across the border and hope that I don't get arrested, which seemed like maybe the easy route and maybe the terrible route. And the other route was I hire a guy, because they do this thing where you can like portage canoes up in Minnesota, and like you can get these guys to give you a tow where they take you across the water to get a head start. So this guy like towed me across the lake, dropped me off on a trail, which like I didn't see humans for the rest of the day. And it's this 14-mile hike to get to this spot. So I'm totally by myself, got my bear spray, got my music playing, just enjoying the view, like climbing over like felled trees. There were probably 40 trees on the path. Like no one's really going in this area. But just kind of this beautiful area. So like my experience of the Boundary Waters is mostly like that trip or a few little day hikes, but I've never actually done the full thing where you take the canoe and you go up there and you go all the way up into Canada into Voyagers. And it's epic. I've seen all these amazing photos. So yeah, that's definitely something I need to explore, but I haven't done that yet.
Yeah, I did a trip there. Gosh, man, it was like 2002 maybe, before I was even into photography at all. And we did the whole Portaging Canoe thing for, I think, about a week. And it was fantastic. I would love to do it again someday.
Yeah, I feel like now is probably the time to do it too, with like the aurora kicking off. We get really nice dark skies up there, and so it seems like I should just go and make it happen. But
Yeah.
I don't know, logistically, it's always kind of falling by the side. Too many ideas, too many passions, too many projects.
I know, I feel that. So, Greg, what were you into before all of these photography irons in the fire that you have going?
So I definitely, like I said, a very curious kind of guy. I've got a lot of like kind of a product development tech kind of background. So, before I was doing that, I actually was working at a medical devices company here in the Twin Cities. This is what brought me here. I'm originally from Michigan, which was a neat job. And before that, I was an engineer at Ford, working on the hybrid electric Escape and Aston Martin and Mustang and all these kind of cool things back in the day. It was a total like dream job coming out of college to like literally every night I got to take home cars. Like,
wow.
Here's the car, here's the gas. Your badge for the door was your badge for gas. I get unlimited gas, and I take home like a brand new Mustang sticker in the window every night, or these weird prototypes like at a Mustang where they cut the hood open to drop in like an F-150 or the Lightning engine, this massive truck engine. Like, the thing would like squeal the tires in fourth gear. So yeah, I definitely have this kind of adventurous tech background. So it sounds like kind of a random set of things, but it all comes together, I think, around this kind of curiosity, and I just kind of love products, building things. Like my software is a big passion for me these days, because it's something really satisfying about like building a thing and sharing it with other people.
Right.
So,
well, cool.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of all that, we're going to dive really deep into what I would say is kind of an emerging tech that you seem to be kind of at the forefront of these days, and that's HDR. So we're going to talk a lot about HDR today, which back in the day I feel like that was called high dynamic range, or that's what it stood for. I guess it still stands for that, but if people have been around for a while, just the use of the word HDR might be a little triggering, like getting some flashbacks to some Trey Ratcliffe type things and all that kind of fun stuff. So why should we be rethinking the use of HDR?
Yeah, like HDR to me is like this terrible branding scenario, because it's the exact same name for something completely different. So the old, like if I talk about like a 1600 nits monitor, or I talk about gain maps, and you have some clue about what I'm talking about, then we're on the same page for HDR. But if I'm talking gibberish, then you're probably thinking about like photomatics. You're probably thinking about nasty, like lifted shadows, grainy images. Like that's a totally different thing. The only thing they really have in common is they're both trying to tackle the same problem, right? Which is that like the real world has this enormous dynamic range, and our cameras are actually really good at capturing it. But then our screens are kind of horrible. They have this limited dynamic range. And so the old HDR approach was, well, let's just try and squeeze everything down into that, and we'll use some like algorithms to like kind of make that work. And it's awful. It doesn't work, right? Like using luminosity mask or something like that does work. That's another thing I use. I think that can work well when you're like really fine tuning the approach, but you're just barely squeezing the real world into this like pretty low tech display. And now there's the new HDR, right? So same problem of like the world has all this dynamic range, but now instead of trying to make compromises, we're actually improving the technology. So we get a better display that can actually show what's in the raw file. So it's the first time you've ever been able to look at an image and actually see almost the entire range of what's in your raw file, to actually see the full range of highlights and shadows. What normally happens is we really care about shadow detail and midtone detail if you think about what's in a raw file. And the highlights are where we say, you know what, I'm going to let that go. And that gets compressed. So you're taking about 4 stops and squeezing it into like less than 1. You just really crush that detail. And that's the right trade-off. If you don't have the display, that's the right thing to do. But with these new displays, you can actually now just take the raw and display it as it is. You really see what it is. So like sunsets glow, city lights glow, skin tones that get pale actually restore some color. It just, all these things that, we get frustrated. We're like, the picture doesn't look like what I saw in real life. That's what HDR is trying to solve. It's trying to solve this problem that our screen is not even close to real life. And HDR is not like reproducing real life. We don't need to look at a screen that's as bright as the sun or anything like that. But it is letting you finally share something much closer to the real experience of what the camera saw.
And do you happen to know, with this new HDR technology, how many stops of dynamic range are within that new technology?
You hear all these different references, and I'm a little bit hesitant because I never really see like what's the basis of it. So generally speaking, SDR, which is standard dynamic range, it's the old school display, which is what we've been using forever, right? SDR typically people would say has about 6 to 8 stops of dynamic range, so it's kind of like film. It's in that zone. With HDR, you're getting up to 4 or even 5 stops of additional dynamic range. So imagine going from like 6 or 8 up to like 12 or 13 stops of dynamic range. I say I'm a little hesitant with that because actual dynamic range is a function of like how your eyes adapted, what are the quality of the shadows. Like there's a lot of things that go into like, are you producing something that's like a scientific measurement, or is it something that actually people can appreciate? But what I can say for sure is, if you're using like a higher end HDR display, you're getting an extra 4 stops, and the difference is like phenomenal. Like if you've never seen one of these like high end displays, when you finally see a properly edited HDR, on a high quality HDR display, you're like, wow, I get it. This is totally different. It just really changes the game.
Got it. Yeah. So it seems like it's one of those things that you really have to see it in real life to appreciate exactly what we're talking about. But before we dive into the nitty gritty, I just wanted to ask you one more kind of dynamic range question. So like you said, we've been using standard definition monitors forever. I've been printing my photographs based on those files for a long time. They look great, in my opinion. The human eye sees about 10 stops of dynamic range, which is oddly enough lower than my Sony a7R5, which has about 11.7 stops of dynamic range. So is this overkill?
No, it's in my testing. I would say I would push as much as maybe about 6 stops before I'd say I was kind of hitting the limits of what I'd appreciate. So even at 4 stops, you can go even further. Like on my screen, I can push it to 5 stops and I see a difference. And I know that if I could push a little bit further, there'd be a benefit. Like there's no point in me editing to that level since I'm trying to cater to people who have the technology and don't have the technology. And at some point you push them so far apart, it's not a great idea. I would say that, if you can get 2 stops, which is super common, like these displays are much more common than we think. That's great. If you get 4 stops, that's amazing. And that'll probably be the standard for a while, but I don't even think that's fully utilizing what you and I can see. You really can push a lot more out of that. I'll give you like an example. Like one of the cases where you might not see detail in your image, you might have a shot where, like if you're properly exposing to the right, then you've made your image as bright as it can be without actually having loss of data where you clip and blow things out. It might still look a little brighter than you necessarily want, whatever, but like you push to the right, you have all this extra detail in there. Well, you might have a shot where, let's say I'm looking down a canyon and, maybe it's like a road descending into the mountains or something. And the foreground is kind of dark, but I've got the image, out of the camera in the raw, and I can see the detail in the foreground, and I don't want to go any darker. If I make the image darker, then I'm going to lose the ability to see the detail in the foreground. But the sky is still blown out. Maybe the clouds are just kind of clipped to white, or the blue sky looks light blue, or it looks even white, And you take an image like that, if you take the exposure slider and you kind of slide it negative, right? You bring it down to 1, 2, 3 stops, you start seeing that stuff come back. We talk about recovering highlight detail. Well, that's everything that an HDR display would show you. Whenever we talk about recovering highlight detail, what you're really talking about is the screen couldn't show it, and now I'm just going to darken the whole thing to put the priority on the highlights and sacrifice the shadows. Right? So anytime you have that experience of like darkening the image and it starts looking better, that's exactly the moment where you're like, oh wow, HDR would look really good here because it will let me see it without having to like ruin the shadows or the midtones to get back those highlights.
That makes total sense. And not to get too technical, but within the last 5 years, we've seen the advent of ISO and variance sensors, like on the Sony A7R4, Sony A7R5. Pretty much, I think the Canon R5, the Nikon, the Z8, the Z9, the Z7, they're all ISO and variant cameras. So like, you can actually test this at home, where you can take a photograph at ISO 100 that's totally underexposed, and then you can take the exact same photograph at ISO 1600, and you can pull up the exposure value in Lightroom on the ISO 100 image, and it will have the exact same amount of noise as the ISO 1600 image. So it's like, the reason I mention that is because there's less and less emphasis on exposing to the right. Like you can recover a ton of detail now in the shadows. So I'm just mentioning that because I'm wondering how that might affect how we think about HDR technology.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So anytime you're doing that, if you're raising the ISO or you're underexposing, then you are not capturing as much detail in the raw file, right? If it's underexposed, then there's like available, room in the file for more highlights, and you didn't fill it. And if you shoot high ISO, you're kind of doing the same thing. So in that case, you're clipping the source, you're reducing the amount of detail in the source. So you're definitely limiting your ability to bring out HDR in the raw in terms of like real contrast. But even then, that's still a good file for HDR. It still can be a good file. Like, so there's two pieces of the HDR puzzle. One is like just capturing what was there and showing it, right? And that's where you want to like shoot raw and expose to the right and do all that kind of stuff to get the most in the data file. But then there's this whole other side of like, HDR is not just an ability to show the real world. It's also a whole new canvas we can paint on. So you can take a low dynamic range, an SDR image, and you can boost it into the HDR range. So one of the ways that I process my images, like I have all these old images that I spent hours editing, and I don't necessarily want to redo all of them. Well, you can push that into the HDR range, and it will still create a really compelling upgrade in a lot of cases when you approach it the right way. So it's not even just like what was the scientific truth of the situation. It's also like artistically, what do I want to create here? And so just even taking like an old, less capable file, that's fine. Like I've taken, for example, 8-bit JPEGs from like Mid-Journey, things like that, right? It's definitely not much data there. And I've converted them to HDR and they look great. So that's one of the cool things, right? Is like it's an artistic tool, not just a scientific tool. We can get into like how you shoot and all that kind of stuff. And ideally there's a way you approach this to get the most out of it, but you don't have to. You use any image.
Well, let's start there. Let's talk about image capture, since that's the first step in the process for creating images. So what considerations should we keep in mind when we start to think about creating HDR images?
So the cool thing about this is you can shoot with any camera any way you want, and you're going to be able to benefit from HDR. So if you want to shoot on a smartphone, you want to scan film from 1940, you have a raw image you shot 20 years ago, they're all perfectly valid sources. Not everything should be edited into HDR. I mean, not everything needs that, just like we don't always use every color, every tone in regular photography. But those could all potentially be great sources. So that's the great thing, is like every image you've ever shot can potentially be improved here. And you don't have to buy new gear. You can shoot with the same camera you have. All that said, there's some things you can do to really optimize your ability to take advantage of it. And all the things you would do to optimize it are the same things you would do for regular SDR, standard dynamic range photography, right? You'd want to shoot raw to have the most data in the file, the most ability to edit it without any consequences. And you'd want to expose to the right? You can do like ISO invariant things, right? You can underexpose, but you are still introducing noise. You are still changing that photo, right? So if you didn't have to deal with low light, ideally you'd shoot with like low ISO and the right shutter speed, and that would be a better raw file. Photography is always trade-offs, right? So the best thing on one dimension is not always the choice you want to make, because you got to think about things other than HDR and whatever else. But yeah, it's really that simple. Properly exposing to the right, shoot as bright as you can without clipping highlights in a raw file. That's going to be your best possible scenario. If you can't do that, then just shooting any raw is going to be your next best choice, even if it's underexposed. That's always going to be your best thing there. And then there's some like special considerations. Like you and I as landscape photographers, we always get this benefit of like a little bit more time to expose and set up and things like that. But let's say, for example, you're a sports photographer and you're on deadlines and you're supposed to have images uploaded to your editor by like the first TV commercial break, right? You're definitely not going to be like editing raw files. Well, a lot of newer cameras have, in addition to like JPEG and RAW, have the ability to save as like a HEIF or a HEIC file. This is a file format that like Apple iPhones capture. I think it's on Sony. I think it's on Canon. I'm not sure which all models have it. But if you have that, that is an HDR capable source. It's not as good as a RAW, but it's basically like an HDR JPEG, if you will. It's a better JPEG. So even if you're on like a tight timeline, you can shoot that way and that data will be in there and it'll look great out of the camera, but you'll also have more in there if you want to go back and like go edit it later. So maybe you've got the quick post today, but then next week you got a portfolio shot you want to bring out of it. You know, shooting with like a HEIC or HEIF would be ideal as opposed to just capturing in JPEG if you can.
There's a lot to chew right there. So maybe let's talk a little bit more about the advantages that HDR can offer. You know, for those of us that are used to editing raw files or using multiple raw files to kind of overcome some of those technical challenges, you know, like maybe you're doing some exposure blending or maybe you're using luminosity masking to kind of pull in some shadow detail or to bring back some of the highlight detail. What advantages does HDR offer for those of us using some of those more traditional models or methods?
Yeah, so there's maybe a few things in there, and remind me so I can go through if I'm missing some parts of your question. But so you talk about like merging images, right? So like, for example, in Lightroom, you can select a bunch of images that you shot like a bracketed sequence of the same thing, different exposures, and then you right click and you choose, I think it's this photo merge, and it'll say merge to HDR.
Right.
So again, it's like the same terms coming up, but it kind of is like yet another different thing. So like when you do that in Lightroom, you're taking these different exposures and you're combining them into sort of like one super raw file that has less noise and more dynamic range. It's still a raw DNG file. It has more range there. If you're not using HDR, then the main benefit of that, in my opinion, is like reducing shadow noise, or if you just don't expose properly, it'll make you less sensitive, right? If you can't get one perfect exposure, you can combine a few. Personally, I'd rather just bracket with small increments and pick the one perfect photograph instead of trying to stitch together these images, but that's an option. When you get to HDR, a single raw file exposed properly already has more dynamic range than even an HDR display can show. So like when we get to the future of even better screens, these raw files are going to keep up. Merging to HDR is therefore still not necessary for HDR. Like I think it's something that should be done rarely. So a lot of people ask me, do I need to bracket and combine photos for HDR? And I'd say definitely not. Maybe like 5% of the time or something like that, you would do it. And it's typically going to be kind of the same scenario as you might otherwise do it. And I think even less these days. Now that we have all these like great AI denoise programs, you can clean up your shadow noise. So one of the challenges with HDR, right, is like when I properly expose to the right, I want to keep that highlight detail. Do I have noisy shadows, right? And so merging exposures might help me with that problem so that I can print a great image and get a great HDR where I've got all the highlight detail and I've got a set of shadows that print clean without noise. Merging to HDR would be another solution to that. But in general, I would rarely merge to HDR. It's not something that's, I think it's overused. And I don't like shortcuts that, you know, like the better solution is learning how to properly expose, right? If you just bracket all the time to do that, you're not really strengthening your skills. If you strengthen those skills and you can now capture one ideal raw file, now you can spend more time getting a second or third composition, and you don't have to worry about things like motion. Like if I'm shooting at the beach, I can't easily blend, you know, a moving wave. I mean, the software will try and do its best, and sometimes it does a really good job, but it can also be a recipe for problems. So I try to avoid those things when I can, but you know, it can be useful. It has its place.
Yeah. I was gonna say the HDR merge in Lightroom, I feel like I've used it 5 times in the last 4 years or something like that. It's usually like only when you're shooting into the sun and you have like crazy shadow detail that's just blown to pieces. I mean, it's very rare that I would even think about bracketing.
And the challenge is, like, let's say that we had the world's best HDR display and it could do 20 stops of dynamic range, and we capture all the thing, we merge the brackets. The next problem you're going to run into is you have so much difference between highlight and shadow that you're going to have lens flare, right? So you're going to have like ghosting and bad shadows, and the technology of your display is frequently going to start to become an issue. So like sometimes you could bracket to that level and it's not going to be a problem, but you're pretty often going to get to the point where, unless you have like really, really high end gear and super clean glass and you approach everything just right, you're going to get to a point where that deep shadow exposure, the really bright one that brings out that shadow detail, you're probably going to look around and be like, oh, it's losing contrast, or there's visible flare or some other problem like that. So at some point, I think you got to accept that it's like this. We're probably approaching a certain bounds to things. But who knows? Maybe we'll get the perfect lenses that never flare, and we'll push even further in the future. Maybe.
Well, let's talk about the more kind of how-to. Like, if I was to create an HDR image, what kind of computer hardware, what kind of software, what is the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about the camera. Any camera will do. On the software front, if you're an Adobe user, you're in great shape because Adobe's added support to every version of Lightroom. You can use HDR on your Android phone, on your iPhone, on your iPad, on your Mac, on your PC. You can even use it on the web browser, which is amazing. So Lightroom has great support. Photoshop has great support for Mac. It's not yet there for PC. There's some workarounds to that. That part's maybe a little bit less ideal. But Adobe Camera Raw has full support for PC and Mac. So most of the stuff you'd want to do with Adobe software is covered really, really well. And if you stick within just the raw tools like Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, it's very, very easy. You basically just enable an HDR mode, and then everything works the same way you're used to. It just allows you to get to brighter values and show more of the detail. So the software piece, if you're going to use Adobe software, is super easy. But there's other programs beyond that. There's Pixelmator Pro has support for HDR for Mac users. You've got Affinity has support for HDR. There's probably a bunch of software programs that I've not even noticed adding support. It's like every time I turn around, there's like some new piece of the ecosystem has suddenly dropped in support. So there's a lot of different software tools. So the software piece is pretty easy. For most people, the thing you're gonna have to figure out is the screen, right? Because you do need HDR technology in your display to show it. But even here, for most people, you probably already have one or two HDR displays and don't even know it. Like if you bought a TV since 2016, most of them have HDR capabilities. So you can plug take an HDMI cable from your laptop to your TV, and when you flick on the right switches and all, boom, you've got HDR on your TV. Your phone, if you bought a phone in the last 4 years, there's a very good chance you've got HDR. Like iPhone, the Samsung, phones, the Pixel phones, they all have really good HDR displays. And they're only getting better because our phones are designed to be used outside in bright conditions. So they're already capable of going super bright. So some of the best displays are actually these phones, which is nice because you can share these images with just about anyone, since most people consume photography on a phone. Then we come over to like laptops. If you bought an Apple laptop since 2018, you've got some degree of support. So any reasonably modern display is going to be okay. And if you've bought any of the Apple Silicon MacBook Pros from the M1 on, you've got a world-class display, a 1600 nits display, meaning it goes super bright, meaning it's super capable for HDR. So these are just incredible displays, like as good as it gets. Outside of that, PC, laptops are kind of mixed. More and more, you're seeing ones that have like OLED displays, and OLED tends to do really well as long as you're not in an overly bright environment. So we can talk about the different technologies, but there's basically two key technologies. There's mini LED, which gives you HDR by allowing you to have brighter light, and you can kind of use it anywhere. And then there's OLED, which gives you better black, but you need to be in a darker room to appreciate the benefit. right? So on laptops on the PC side, it's a little bit mixed. And then you've got external monitors, and their support is a little bit mixed. You've got a lot of monitors that have like some degree of HDR capability, many that don't have any, and then you've got some that are really, really good. Like Asus has a whole bunch of different HDR capable displays. Dell's got a display. Apple has their super expensive Pro Display XDR is incredible. That's the one I use every day. So there's a bunch of different options there for the hardware, but that's the piece that most people need to go figure out is, do I have the display? I would tell people, like, don't go out and buy anything. Just, try Lightroom on your phone, or, plug into your TV, or better yet, go to like the Apple store, go jump on any of their MacBook Pros. Safari doesn't yet support it, but if you jump on Chrome, you can just like run Chrome without even installing it on these laptops, and just look at my webpage. I've got like demos on my gregbenzphotography.com/HDR. You'll be able to see it there, and you're looking on a world-class display, so you can see exactly what it does. But I think just experiencing it so you can get a sense of like what it looks like, and then you can start making these decisions. But I think there's, most people probably have one of these HDR displays already. It's probably more a question of like, should I buy another external monitor or something like that? And I think my best answer to that is, definitely think about it when you're ready to upgrade. But I think the first step is just see it for yourself, so you start to understand it before you worry about like what gear you're going to buy. So that'll be the most complex part, is just getting the display. But the software part is really easy, and the camera part, you literally can't screw it up. You always have options, even if you didn't think about HDR.
Yeah, and I noticed on the the webpage that you mentioned, you have all of these tests that you can perform in order to see if your browser and your monitor is HDR enabled. And so maybe walk us through a little bit of kind of what it takes in order for someone to fully capitalize on this technology.
Yeah, so you're going to need a screen that gets bright enough, or perhaps dark enough, with like an OLED. The easiest way to just test any screen, if you go to my site, I've got those tests, and the first test will determine your headroom. And headroom is basically a measure of like the capability you have for HDR. So if we look at like HDR and just break down the technology, it's basically like the screen has a certain amount of brightness reserved for like just regular SDR content, and anything that's left over is what gets used for HDR. So if I have a really highly capable screen, then its peak brightness is higher, and it just has more headroom, that difference between the SDR and the HDR range there. If I have a less capable one, it has a little bit less. So that headroom test is basically telling you this is how much additional capability you have over a standard screen, and it's measured in stops. So, if you go on my site, you might see 0 stops if you have an SDR display or you haven't configured it for HDR. But if you have an HDR display, then it's going to tell you you've got like 1, 2, 3, 4 stops of headroom. I would say that, any amount can be beneficial, but things start getting really exciting when you see like 2 stops. That's usually the point where there's enough of a difference compared to conventional photography that it starts to really have a wow factor. If you were looking at like what to buy in a store, there's a few things you can look at, and I've got a whole list of like a recommended monitors page, and on there it kind of goes through all the things to shop for. But the big thing is like, how bright does the screen get? Because ultimately the technology that makes this possible is we're making pixels brighter without causing problems in the shadows. Like 20 years ago, if we turned up the backlight, made it brighter, all the blacks would get really gray. And so that didn't help anything, right? It's like you just made brighter SDR, whereas HDR is actually giving you more dynamic range. These new screens, they now have more control to like give you the precision where they can make a bright pixel and still keep dark blacks. So that's the key thing to look for, is that brightness. So something like these Apple displays where they have 1600 nits of brightness, that's amazing. Like if you get 1000 nits or more, you've got a great display that's going to work in a wide range of situations. If you have an OLED, which most of our TVs would be something like this, you notice like if you watch your movie on your TV in the middle of the day, it doesn't look great, but if you watch it at night, it looks awesome. That's kind of that range of like having like maybe 500-600 nits of OLED, where it'll look amazing if you don't have your eyes adapted to bright light, you don't have things reflecting off the screen, like all these things that ruin your ability to see the shadows. So that's, a 600 nits OLED or any screen that hits 1,000 nits is probably going to be really good, but that test on my page will tell you. And then once you have it, it's a question of like turning it on, right? So if you have an Apple display, it just works. Like you're not going to have any problem unless you perhaps like do calibration of your screen, in which case there's some things that I cover like on my page talking about like what you do there. But it just kind of works out of the box. You don't have to think about it. There's nothing to really set up. If you have an external monitor on a Mac or you have a PC, you're going to have to go and flip a little switch in the system settings for the operating system that basically just says to flip on HDR mode, at which point things should just generally work. There's a few other edge cases beyond that I cover on my page, but for most people, it's like I get an HDR screen, maybe I need to turn on HDR mode on the operating system, and then I just go start editing in HDR over in Lightroom or whatever. So the process for most people is going to be pretty simple, but it sort of depends what you're using.
Yeah, so I can already imagine that there's a lot of listeners that are thinking to themselves, because I am, that, okay, that all sounds fantastic, but, I edit my photographs for print. Like, I'm assuming, yeah, of course I want them to look good on the screen, but my ultimate edit is really going to be for when I'm printing for my customers and my clients. And I happen to know through lots of trial and error and lots of failure that if you edit on a really bright screen and you go to print that file, it's going to be really dark, right? Like it's going to not translate into print the way that it looks on a backlit monitor. So how do we reconcile that difference between what an HDR monitor makes our file look like versus what we want the final print to look like?
So you kind of covered two things there. One is just like, how do you set up the monitor for print with a regular SDR image? And you can still do that with an HDR monitor. You don't have to make the monitor bright. You can make it look like any other monitor, same brightness range. Like when I do my print work, I'm editing at 80 to 120 nits. When I say a nit, like in your calibration software, it'd say like CD per square meter. That's a nit. So I can still do the same thing where my prints, I edit the same way I always did. They print the same. Everything's reliable, looks great. So that's just a configuration thing, and you can control that with an HDR monitor. Then there's an actual HDR edit. You go turn on the HDR mode. You push the pixels up into the HDR range, because anything in the HDR range is brighter than the old traditional SDR white. And by definition, white in a regular image is the paper, right? We just make everything darker from that point. So the literal interpretation of an HDR image in print would require like inks that glow, right? So it's not right. Like that would be an HDR print. So if you backlit the print, maybe you do that. But the way that we have defined prints, there's nothing left over for HDR. So if you want to do HDR and print, you could directly print in HDR. Like Lightroom will let you do that, and we can talk about like what that is. But there's a process called tone mapping, where it's squeezing the image down. And that's with the old process of taking the wide dynamic range and squeezing it down. And so naturally, that's not probably what you want to do. You print that, you're going to have the old HDR problems. But what you do instead is, you can support both print and HDR, because you can either edit in HDR first, and then there's good techniques to bring it down to an SDR without the tone mapping. There's better ways to do it, and they're not hard to do that. Or you can edit your image exactly the same way you always did for SDR, and then you can up convert it for HDR, right? For example, like I've got a software plugin called WebSharp Pro. It has a built-in ability to upgrade any SDR to HDR. So a bunch of the images on my site, I just ran through my software. They are images I've literally print and sold to clients, and I wanted to populate my website quickly. So I ran into the software and it made HDRs for me. There's a number of ways you could do that manually in Lightroom, ACR, Photoshop. It's all pretty easy, but the key thing is you're basically going to make a version of your image for the screen and a version of your image for the print. Obviously, if you're selling prints, you don't want to show people the HDR and then give them a print that's not as good, because the HDR, the whole point is it looks better. So when you go in the opposite direction, you're like, oh man, that's a bummer. Like it looked better on the screen. So you don't want to be selling people from that, but you can have both. When I go and sell prints, I'm walking in with a large iPad. I'm showing people my SDR image. They know exactly what they're going to get. They get that. But then when I go online, I've got a different audience, and maybe I just kick up the brightness a little bit. I don't have to use 4 stops of HDR. Maybe I just use a little bit to enhance the image, give it a little more pop, or maybe I push it further. It's up to me. But to me, these worlds are separated, so I'm okay having both versions. And the workflow itself is really, it's super easy. You just have to like go in with the mindset that you're gonna make one little tweak, and it could be so many different approaches. You can make it as complicated as you want if you want to optimize every little variable, but you can get like truly outstanding results if you just keep processing the image the same way you always have, and at the last step, just upgrade that print version a little bit for the screen to be an HDR.
So just real quick, nitty gritty, my assumption would be something like you right click, you create a virtual copy in Lightroom, you enable the HDR, you edit it a little bit further, and then you're done. I mean, that's basically what you're talking about?
Yeah, it literally could be that simple, right? So virtual copy is a great way to do it. So maybe you go boost the highlights or make a curve adjustment, whatever, you're just pushing up into that range. Maybe you're turning on the HDR mode and you're working with a RAW, and it just automatically shows, like if you've got data that goes beyond the SDR range and it's a RAW file and you turn on HDR mode, it's just going to immediately look better. So a lot of times you literally could create the virtual copy, click the HDR button, and you're done. You're like, wow, that already improved the image. But you can go beyond that. If you want to go the opposite direction, if you're someone who cares more about the screen and occasionally prints, you can edit the HDR, and you can just do the same thing where you create a virtual copy and you just turn off the HDR mode and make appropriate edits. Or you could do, stuff in Photoshop. There's a lot of ways you can approach it, but coming from either direction is totally fine. It's mostly a question of like, what do you care about more? If you print all the time, then I would start with the print and make the HDR after. And if you print occasionally, then maybe you start with the HDR and, then you make the print when you need it.
Perfect. Well, let's talk about file types. So it's really interesting because just last night, I was in a little bit of a conversation on a Discord channel about different file types like WebP and JPEG and AVIF. Is that right?
Yeah, AVIF, yeah.
And I know that AVIF has got a little bit more color fidelity than WebP files in terms of compressing down the data. What are some HDR compatible files, and why should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of technologies here. One is like, how do you just take an HDR image and share the HDR as it is? If you do that, you leave it to the web browser to create the SDR version if the viewer doesn't have HDR technology, right? And so that's not the preferred way to share, at least on the web. So there's a whole new type of technology called a gain map. And a gain map basically allows you to take an SDR version of the image and an HDR version of the image and put them into the same file. So that if I share it with 10 people and half of them have HDR screens, they get an enhanced view. But the other half of the people, they don't suffer some bad looking image. They still get the same thing I always would have given them before. So this really nice fallback. And they can use a browser from like 1998 and it's going to work. Like it doesn't have to have HDR. It doesn't have to know what a gain map is. It doesn't have to have anything. It just will work. So that's a really nice bridging technology in this world now where some people have better displays than others, is this gain map. And that's the way that you probably want to create it. The gain map itself can be applied to different types of file formats. So a JPEG can be turned into a gain map, and that's the way that you would do it now. But in the future, we're going to have support for other file formats like HEIF. On an iPhone has it with it's a slightly different format, but that's in there. AVIF will support it. So there's going to be a lot of different file formats that will support these gain maps. But that's the most important thing when you're sharing the image, is to make sure that everybody gets a good view. And so a gain map is going to be an important thing to do if that's your goal. If you're just trying to display it on your own phone or TV and you know it's HDR, it doesn't matter. But for generally sharing on the web, you'd want that. So then the other piece of that is the file format, right? So you mentioned like all these other newer file formats. So a JPEG historically would not be suitable. It's an 8-bit file format. And when you have less bits, you're more prone to seeing banding, right? Where you see like discrete changes in like gradients. And the more contrast in an image, the more likely you are to see banding. So when you have HDR, it's getting brighter, so it has more contrast. So an HDR needs greater bit depth to avoid banding. So historically, a JPEG wouldn't cut it, but now that we have a gain map, it actually is like this second file in the JPEG. So it's kind of like the secretly improved JPEG, and it works, which is kind of crazy. But even better than that are these file formats that are modernized. So JPEG's been around forever. Now we've got HEIF and AVIF and these other formats. And the one that's really exciting that people should pay attention to is AVIF. So the extension is AVIF. And even if you don't care about HDR, this is the file format of the future. And AVIF will support transparency, so you don't need like a PNG file. With it's much smaller than a JPEG, like on average 30% smaller. So you get faster uploads, faster downloads, all that kind of good stuff. It supports higher bit depth. You can get banding on an 8-bit JPEG in the SDR range. So even for just non-HDR content, an AVIF can look better. So AVIF is amazing, right? Because it's a smaller file with better quality. Seems like this weird conundrum, but we've learned from like 30 years of improving technology how to do this. So AVIF is a great way to share any image, and especially to share an HDR image. So that, I think, in time will be the standard. We're not there yet for like AVIF with a gain map. That standard is still kind of working through like standards committees and that kind of stuff. But I think that's what we'll be doing soon enough, which is awesome. But even today, just a JPEG gain map, that would be the one thing people should know. And if you're using Adobe software, like in Lightroom, you literally just say, I want to export a JPEG, and there's a little box that says HDR output. When you tick that box, you're basically saying, I want to keep this as an HDR image. That's telling it to make the gain map. So it automatically embeds that image. It doesn't have the word gain map, but that's what it's doing. So it's really not complicated at all. You just choose a JPEG, click that little box, and in the future, whatever software you're using, hopefully we'll start supporting AVIF pretty soon. There's already like prototype software out there, like developer mode in Chrome and stuff shows it. It looks awesome. So I think that's kind of the format of the future there. So the thing people need to figure out is with these gain maps, the thing that makes them great is you're in control of the HDR and the SDR. So it's maybe a little bit less about the technology at some point. It's just understanding like you want to go and put your hands on what does that SDR look like. Like if you just tick the box to export the HDR as is, you get the default Lightroom settings. But when you turn on that mode, you have the ability to go in and move these sliders. There's this little area in Lightroom where Adobe Camera Raw says preview for SDR display. And you go in there, and what it's literally doing is showing you, this is the SDR I'm going to create for you from the HDR. And you can move those sliders around to control what it looks like. So that's your ability as an artist to go and optimize that version of it. And in the future, we'll probably have the ability to just fully control both for the people who really want like ultimate control of everything. Like I'm pretty excited about an open source project that Google's been supporting that I think is going to enable some of this in the near future where, for people like myself who really want to just like control every aspect of it, it's there. And the cool thing is like, this is not like some faraway technology. It like, already works with Instagram, for example. We just don't yet have like the tool to encode that unique thing, but it's inevitable. So I know that's kind of like a lot of different pieces of that whole puzzle. Yeah.
And then the checkbox for export as HDR, I assume that only shows up if you have HDR enabled on the file.
I think so. I don't remember. I assume so.
I don't think I've ever seen it. So I haven't played around yet. So
I would assume so. Yeah, you just when you're in an HDR mode. So like at the top of your image when you're editing, there's like the little button you'd click to go black and white. Right next to that's the HDR button, right? So you turn that on, and then like down below the sliders for like exposure and all that. That's where you see a little preview for SDR display to control that. And then when you export, you just take that little HDR box to get that export. So it's honestly, like if we were sitting down here and it's just showing you in person, it's like not even a 5-minute learning curve to do all this stuff in Lightroom. It's really pretty simple. That's all pretty straightforward. The only other piece you really need to know about is like not everyone supports all these file formats. So I think what gets confusing to people is like, oh, well, I made it and it looks great in Lightroom, but then I go and like open it in like this other piece of software and it doesn't look the same. And I think people just need to be aware that like this is a new technology, and so it's still deploying, right? It's still rolling out. So not everyone has support for HDR in their software. Not every piece of software has support for every HDR format. Like, I mean, that, you know, there'll come a day when this is all like every bit as common as just any other JPEG we use today. But if you create one of these, HDR gain maps and you put it on your website, as long as it doesn't get changed in that process, like if you put it through an upload process that will resize and crop your image, then it might be changing your image. And eventually that won't be a problem either. But today you might have to take a little more control, but you can just post these on your website with this little, it looks like a JPEG, but it's got that hidden gain map. And so anyone who's got support for it is going to see this enhanced image, and anyone who doesn't know any better because they still get a great looking image. So it's mostly just kind of having an appreciation for what these file formats are, and then everything just sorts itself out like really nicely.
Yeah, I know my CMS automatically converts my uploaded JPEGs into WebP files because it's a much tighter conversion, and the platform I use is very optimized for SEO, and so that smaller file size is like the king. That's like the main decision maker. And I understand that AVIF files aren't supported yet by Google search like a JPEG would be in terms of like alt data and things like that, but I'm sure that's coming too.
Yeah, I don't know about that piece. I would assume so. I mean, Google's been a big supporter of AVIF in a number of ways. Like they have AVIF gain map support in Chrome and things like that. AVIF at this point is now supported by every web browser. Like just about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, Edge added support. That was like the one holdout. So the only people who don't have support for AVIF now are people who just haven't updated their browser in like the last 2 months or so. So that's already a great file format. And I would think from an SEO perspective, Google probably loves it because the files are like 30% smaller. So if I have like a photography website and everything loads much faster, that's great, right? They always penalize you for slow page loads. So I'm sure that's going to be like the way of the future is AVIF.
You'd mentioned before we were recording that that you're doing some testing on some HDR enabled monitors. Have you found certain brands of monitors to be a little bit better at this than others so far?
Yeah, so like I said before, the monitor part is where things maybe get a little bit trickier on some of this stuff. If you get something like an Apple display, they really have made it so simple. Like it just works. You don't have to think about it. The color is accurate. Like everything about it's just dead simple. Apple, like I try to be platform agnostic. My customer base is heavily using Windows. And I think there's a lot of great things about Windows, but I think when it comes to HDR displays or laptop for just general like battery life and performance, I think Apple's like in another league. So these Apple displays are really nice, and it's the one time in like the last 20 years I tell people you probably should consider switching if this is what you want to do. It's that good. You don't have to. You can definitely do it on Windows, but it's that good. Just makes life really easy. If you're not in that mode, or if you have an Apple laptop and you still want a bigger monitor, right now you got to consider some other things. So for Apple users, if you get the Pro Display XDR, which I have, it's basically the same display as the laptop, just bigger. It's expensive. I mean, it's a $5,000 display minimum, brand new, but I bought mine used for $3,000 with the stand, so I got it half off. There's always kind of ways around some of this stuff, and I love it. It's a beautiful display. But if you don't get that, there's a lot of other options out there. I think ASUS has a really nice lineup, so I've been going through those. I've got 3 different ASUS monitors I'm putting through the paces right now. One thing I really like about ASUS is that they let you calibrate in the HDR range. Like some of their models come with a calibration device externally. Some have it built in physically to the monitor, like this little thing just kind of swivels out. You get this little motor, and the calibrator comes up, and it'll run itself overnight for you if you want. That's really nice because one of the areas we don't have HDR support yet is like in ICC profiles. So if you make an ICC profile for your monitor, that does not support HDR. So having it built into the display itself in the hardware solves that problem. You don't need a profile. So I really like that aspect of the ASUS lineup. And they've got this new flagship monitor that came out like a month or 2 ago that's really, really nice. And in some ways, better than the Pro Display XDR at half the price. So that's really nice. Outside of that, there's a lot of monitors out there that are designed for gamers that tend to have pretty good HDR. They're not as color accurate. So if you're someone who wants to tinker with HDR and you don't need perfect color accuracy, at least in the HDR domain, that's an option. Especially if you're a gamer, you probably already have it. But if you calibrate for color there and it's not built into the monitor, then you're gonna have to toggle between, like, I'm in an HDR mode without calibration and I toggle for my print work, and it adds a little complexity. Or you can do it with a TV. And TVs are a great way to go. TVs are really cheap. You can get like an LG C3. Like, Hollywood movies are, not infrequently made on a display like that. I've talked to a lot of folks who make Hollywood movies and they use the C2 or the C3. You can buy one of these, like 42 inches, for under $1,000. And it's a beautiful display. But it's also a 42-inch display. Not everyone wants a screen that big. You actually, it's almost like you get too much. You actually want a smaller display. So if you can find that, that'd be ideal. And of course, monitors operate a little bit differently. To get accurate color out of a monitor, you need a little bit more expertise in terms of like how to set up the monitor. It's not like most people just put like the spider on the screen and the software takes care of it. With a monitor, the calibration is done through the settings on the display itself most of the time. And there's a bit of a learning curve there. I mean, if you're lucky, if you buy a major brand, there might be a video on like how to do it online, and you just follow their steps, or sometimes even copy their recipe and get close enough. Like, they might tell you, these are my settings, and it's like, it's good enough. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but I'm a huge fan of the Apple lineup. I think the Asus stuff is really promising. And I think the TVs for most people are like the display you already have. So I would encourage people, just start, getting in and playing with it. Like these edge cases of like, how do you print and all the stuff. Like I just explore it first and then you can kind of come back. It's way too much trying to think about all this stuff at once. So like, don't rush out and buy a new monitor just yet. Like, go try it for a month, get comfortable with it. Drop me an email. I'm always happy to take questions from people. Like, I get questions all the time on like, how can I share my HDR images on my TV and this and that? It's a very cool world. Everyone I know who's like seen this on a good display just immediately is kind of like, wow, that's something really different. And it kind of sucks people in. And I think we're in a world where it's definitely a pioneering technology, right? You and I've talked about a lot of different little kind of gotchas or things you got to know. That is rapidly improving. Like, it's not like we're going to finish 2024 and every problem solved. But I do think we're rapidly getting to an era where a lot of the pitfalls are covered. The ease of use is improving. Like, so now's a great time to get in and start exploring and know that, like, if you don't know every little thing today, a lot of these things are going to get fixed. And I'm always happy to take a question, whatever, on some of these things if you're venturing out. But if you already have the technology, if you have the TV, you have the Apple laptop, whatever, definitely try it out, because you probably don't even realize what you have.
Love it. And I'm assuming that webpage that you built will help kind of guide people through a process to figure out whether or not they have a display that can pull it off or not.
Yeah, so if they go to gregbenzphotography.com/HDR, that's kind of like the central hub. So I've got demo images. I've got a series of tests that'll help you understand what capabilities your monitor has. There's a link there to like recommended monitors, which is a whole separate page where I can go through in greater depth the stuff we've been talking about in terms of like how you would shop for a monitor. I've got like an ebook that goes through like how to set up your TV and all this and that. So, I mean, like I said, for most people, like I'm kind of covering like a lot of bases here. For most people, it's like I flip on the HDR switch, I just use it. But there's so many different possible screens and all that it gets a little more complicated. Right. So I kind of have that all covered there. And hopefully it's laid out in a way where you can just quickly find the answer for your particular setup. But if it's not there, drop me an email and I'm always happy to answer those questions. Awesome.
Well, Greg, I had one more set of questions for you. I know that you're most well known for your Lumenzia Photoshop panel. Maybe talk a little bit about what it does and why people might want to consider picking it up.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I've got like WebSharp Pro, which is for like exporting images and all, and then Lumenzia is the luminosity masking software. And so for those who don't know that, luminosity masking is a way of creating masks or selections from the actual pixel content of your image. So if I have a sky that looks blown out, I can go in and select highlights in the image to refine those blown out highlights. And the beautiful thing about luminosity masks is because they come from the actual pixel content, they just naturally, seamlessly fit with the image. So when you make edits that way, you get high accuracy, a really natural looking result. And oftentimes you can get to a better result faster than trying to use some other tool and tweak around these different things. It's very open-ended. I mean, anytime you might use a mask or selection in Photoshop is potentially a case where a luminosity mask could make it better. So it's like as open-ended as Photoshop. But the main things people would do with Lumenzia would be things like exposure blending, where I could go and take a couple different images or one image and process a couple of different ways and bring it together to restore blown sky detail without having to use something like HDR. I mean, you can do the blending in HDR too. It'll support that. But you get more capability to kind of restore details for print and that kind of thing. Dodging and burning is another major use case. So if you want to go and let's say you've got, like that image that's behind you on the wall there, you've got that lit face of the mountain and you got the shadow side. And, that's what's creating a sense of depth and interest in that scene, is that you've got highlight and shadow and kind of shades the mountain, and you can see that. Well, straight out of the camera, there is highlight and shadow, but you can take a luminosity, mask, and you target highlight and shadow, and you can push it a little further and add that sort of micro contrast, that local contrast to create that separation, to really bring out that depth and dimension in the scene with something like that. And then there's just all sorts of other crazy one-offs that people are trying to edit the whites of an eye, or they're working on the feathers of a bird, or whatever. There's a lot of different things you could use it for. But anytime that you want to target a particular part of the image and make a local edit, it can really help with that. And it's, like I said, it's a plug into Photoshop, so it's designed to work hand in hand with like Photoshop proper.
Yeah, and for people that I only use Lightroom does everything. I will just tell you, I've used both Lightroom masking and Photoshop luminosity masking panels. It is much more accurate. There's a lot more you can do with it, but I would say that it has a slightly longer learning curve, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, there's definitely a learning curve. I always try and tell people, like, you're going to get a lot out of it, but you got to put a little bit in to understand it. Once you understand it, it's quick and easy, but there is definitely that learning curve. The other piece, we've talked about like the precision of the mask. The other piece is like, if you think about like masking in Lightroom, like let's say the masks were perfect, you don't even get to use all the Lightroom tools with local masks. You can't use like camera calibration, or you can't use like the color mixer. There's these various tools that don't exist, and then you have all the other tools inside of Photoshop. So when you're working with a luminosity mask, you not only have a better mask, but you have access to any tool you want, not just like some limited set of raw tools. I mean, I think the local masks in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw are amazing, and I use them a lot. But I think this is like one more tool to add into the mix with the luminosity masks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, last question, Greg. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who is somebody that we haven't had on the show yet that you think we would get a kick out of talking to?
Yeah, you kind of teed that out with me. I was looking at the list. You've done an amazing job of interviewing so many incredible photographers and instructors. One I don't think you had on your list was Blake Rudis, who I think just does an awesome job of just kind of exploring things in a different way. He has a lot of focus on color. I think that's definitely kind of his key thing. Just a super nice guy. Blake and I have had the opportunity to connect around some different presentations and that sort of thing, and I think he'd be great on the show.
Awesome. Well, Greg, thank you for sharing all of your in-depth knowledge about HDR, and man, I think it's an exciting time to be a photographer.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's fun to see the medium get pushed forward, where we have this whole new artistic canvas to paint on.
Love it. Well, thank you to Greg for the awesome chat about HDR. Since we recorded, I picked up a new monitor that can handle HDR, and I can tell you it's quite interesting to play with, so I encourage y'all to give it a shot. Have you dabbled with this new technology? I'd love to hear about your experiences with it on our Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/fstop and listen, and find this episode to engage in the conversation. It's free. Cheers. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.